This is the silence that follows the echo of arrogance. We were in Hangar Bay 4, a nondescript cathedral of cold steel and repurposed air, the temporary nerve center for Operation Chimera. It smelled of ozone, jet fuel, and the stale, desperate energy of men who hadn't slept properly in 72 hours. The air conditioning unit hummed a low, industrial prayer, but beneath that mechanical noise, there was the sharp, grating sound of disrespect. It was focused entirely on Sergeant Reynolds. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in the briefing room, not in this pristine, polished environment reserved for gold bars and silver wings. Reynolds was a wrench-turner, a technical expert, someone who belonged beneath the fuselage, stained with hydraulic fluid and oil. Her flight suit, a dark, non-standard olive drab, patched only with her blood type and a single faded rank chevron, looked like an insult next to the crisp white-collar flight gear worn by the air superiority pilots. Latu. Colonel Thorne, the poster boy for the F-22 Raptor program, stood over her. Thorne was the kind of man who measured his worth in G-forces and public relations accolades. His voice cut through the hum like shattered glass. "Sergeant," he drawled, the word heavy with contempt. "I asked if you understood the modifications, not if you'd performed them. There's a difference, isn't there? A vast, cavernous difference between turning a socket and comprehending a strategic vulnerability." Reynolds didn't flinch. She was seated at a console, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. She didn't look up, which only seemed to fuel Thorne's aggressive posturing. Her posture was the first anomaly I noticed. Most enlisted personnel, especially technical staff faced with a lieutenant colonel, a potential wing commander, would shrink, offer rapid affirmations, or stammer apologies. Reynolds did none of that. She occupied the space fully, completely, effortlessly. Her hands were the second anomaly. They were rough, yes, scarred from years of unforgiving metalwork, but they moved with the eerie precision of a concert pianist. She was typing notes on the flight telemetry, not looking at Thorne, but listening to the specific frequency of his breathing, a detail only someone trained to hear the quiet threat would register. "I understand, Colonel," she finally said, her voice a low contralto, devoid of inflection. It didn't apologize. It stated a fact. Thorne chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that bounced off the steel walls. He stepped closer, planting his hands on the table, leaning in so his polished silver rank insignia was inches from her face. "No, Sergeant, I truly doubt you do. You see, the F-22 isn't some relic F-15 you can hotwire with a screwdriver. We are talking about predictive AI targeting, dynamic camouflage protocols, things that require, let's call it, advanced cognitive processing, things that the grease monkeys rarely need to trouble themselves with." His eyes flickered dismissively over her plain flight suit. "Speaking of which, Sergeant, why are you wearing that? Did someone confuse the laundry order? That suit looks like something pulled out of a storage locker from the Gulf War. We have standards here, Reynolds. Appearance reflects capability. If you're going to be breathing our air, try to look like you belong in the 21st century." Thorne felt safe. He was surrounded by his peers, 4 junior pilots, all freshly minted, basking in the reflection of his authority. They were chuckling quietly into their mugs of black coffee. To them, Thorne was simply enforcing necessary boundaries. Reynolds was clearly just an aging technician who had overstepped her meager authority by daring to comment on the tactical modifications. Reynolds finally lifted her eyes. They were the color of cold river stone, gray and unnervingly steady. There was no anger there, only the deep, vast boredom of someone watching a predictable, slow-motion train wreck. "Colonel," she replied, her voice still quiet, "the modifications you're referencing, the dynamic camouflage protocols, were my contingency recommendation 6 months ago, after reviewing the telemetry from exercise Red Flag 23. I designed the firmware. I wrote the code. And I specifically calibrated the spectral shifting based on the data stream you dismissed as anomalous noise last Thursday." Thorne paused, his smile freezing mid-contempt. The junior pilots stopped stirring their coffee. Thorne recovered quickly, dismissing her statement as impossible bragging. "Preposterous, Reynolds. That code comes directly from the Advanced Systems Command in Nevada. Are you implying you are a lead programmer for ASC?" "I am implying," she corrected calmly, meeting his gaze without blinking, "that you should check the metadata signature on the protocol update file marked Chimera Alpha. The author tag reads REYNOLDS. It's an unusual file signature, I know. It uses archaic encryption keys, but it works. Thorne's face flushed crimson. He hadn't expected the tech to fight back with actual data. He realized he was losing control of the room, not because of the data, but because of her quiet confidence. This needed to end now, decisively, using the only weapon he possessed. Rank. He leaned in further, his voice dropping to a dangerous low hiss, meant only for her ears yet penetrating the silence of the room. Listen to me, Sergeant. I fly the $20 billion machine. You fix the toilet when it breaks. Your opinion on my tactics is noted and hereby disregarded. Now take your antique flight suit, gather your tools, and get out of my briefing area. I want to see this area sterilized in 3 minutes, or I'll have your commanding officer detailing you to latrine duty for the next fiscal quarter. Is that understood? The threat was explicit, brutal, and entirely within his power to execute. He watched for the expected collapse of her composure, the fear, the hurried apology, the desperate scramble to retreat. He saw none of it. Reynolds leaned back slightly, adjusting her position, a movement so subtle it was barely perceptible. It was the movement of a tiger shifting its weight just before the kill. Her eyes narrowed infinitesimally. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the massive reinforced steel door to the AOC control room, a door designed to withstand a direct missile hit, slammed open with a heavy, purposeful thud. 7 figures entered. They moved as one unit, a wave of high command that instantly sucked the air and the light out of the room. They were the absolute apex of Air Force authority. 4 3-star generals, 2 4-star generals, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Holloway, a man whose face was etched into the history books of modern warfare. They were flanked by a small, silent security detail. The room froze. Thorne, caught mid-threat, straightened instantly, snapping to attention so violently I could almost hear the pop of his neck vertebrae. His face, moments ago purple with condescending rage, was now chalk white with pure, instinctive military deference. The generals, heavy with rank and purpose, swept into the room. They were looking for someone. Their eyes scanned the high-tech consoles, the scattered pilots, the overall layout. They were running late for the final planning phase of Chimera, and their impatience radiated like heat. Thorne began to stammer, trying to initiate the mandatory formal welcome address. Generals, Admiral, welcome to... Admiral Holloway walked straight past him. All 7 commanders ignored Thorne's rigid salute, bypassing him completely as if he were a particularly dense piece of furniture blocking the hallway. Their trajectory was fixed. It led them straight to Sergeant Reynolds. The 4 junior pilots were now utterly motionless, breath held, watching their immediate superior being treated as invisible by the most powerful men in the theater. Admiral Holloway stopped 2 feet from Reynolds's console. The sound of his immaculate dress shoes stopping on the polished floor echoed in the sudden, crushing silence. Reynolds, however, remained seated. She hadn't moved a muscle since the generals entered. She simply watched them arrive, her gaze calm. The moment stretched, a solid minute of unbearable silence where the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. military stood before a sergeant, waiting. Then, General Miller, a legend known for his terrifying efficiency and his command of global strategic airlifts, did something no one in that room, least of all Thorne, expected. General Miller, a man who had not saluted anyone lower than a chief of staff in 2 decades, snapped to attention. His hand rose crisply to his brow, delivering a perfect, rock-solid salute to the seated Sergeant Reynolds. The other 6 generals followed instantly. 7 salutes, delivered with absolute, profound deference, focused entirely on the woman in the faded, non-standard flight suit. Thorne watched the scene unfold, his mind visibly shattering under the pressure of the impossible contradiction. His jaw went slack. The 4 young pilots began to sweat, realizing they had been part of a disciplinary action against someone who clearly possessed a status beyond the normal structure. Reynolds did not return the salute. She was seated. A sergeant does not remain seated when saluted by a 4-star general, unless the rank structure simply does not apply. Admiral Holloway didn't salute until Reynolds gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then, he dipped his head slightly, not as a superior but as a subordinate acknowledging acceptance. Holloway spoke, his voice deep, gravelly, and entirely deferential. "Ma'am," he began, using the highest term of respect reserved for female officers, yet she wore no bars, no stars. "I apologize for the delay. We had unexpected resistance on the deployment plan review. We require your final sign-off on the parameters before we hit execute." He paused, looking down at her, the gravity of the mission hanging in the air. "Did you confirm the spectral shift capability? We need zero margin for error, Spectre." The codename hit Thorne like a physical blow. Spectre. The name was whispered in every security agency, every black operation, every command structure that dealt with the impossible. Spectre wasn't a person. Spectre was a myth. Spectre was the legendary technical architect who didn't just understand advanced warfare systems. She invented them, usually on the back of a napkin in a compromised forward operating base. Spectre was the reason half of those generals had their stars. They were running her systems. Thorne's eyes, wide and horrified, finally focused on the last crucial detail of her appearance, the detail he had dismissed as a laundry mistake. On the collar of her worn, olive-drab flight suit, almost invisible against the dark fabric, was a small, stitched insignia. It wasn't a rank chevron. It was a single, stylized design, a silver wraith, barely perceptible, stitched directly into the material. It wasn't a standard issue patch. It was the insignia of the Clandestine Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, Technical Directorate, given only to field operatives who designed and then deployed their own technologies, operatives who worked outside the military pay grade structure, answerable only to the highest political command. The flight suit wasn't old and dirty. It was operational. It was exactly what she needed for the field, customized and purpose-built. He had laughed at the uniform of the most dangerous, technically proficient ghost the military had ever produced. He hadn't been talking down to a technician. He had been belittling the source of their entire mission's strategic advantage. Reynolds finally addressed the Admiral, but her voice was low enough that it still felt like a private conversation. "Admiral, the protocols are sound. The shift is calibrated to the known spectrum of the adversary's radar harmonics. But I told the command 6 months ago, it runs too hot. It creates an internal thermal signature that needs continuous thermal dumping. If the pilot exceeds G-force protocol during the first stage, they cook the internal hardware." She briefly glanced up at Thorne, a look that wasn't malicious but merely professional. "The colonel here was insisting that the system was robust enough to handle any G-force I can throw at it, Admiral. He was operating under the assumption that a technical limitation is somehow a personal challenge to his ego." She returned her attention to Holloway. "The hardware limitation stands. Exceeding 9.5 G for longer than 8 seconds in the dense atmosphere means mission failure, and potentially the loss of the pilot. I need to know if the pilots have been briefed on the strict G-force ceiling for the initial infiltration run, or if they are planning to ignore the hard limits of the tech they rely on." The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of bureaucratic accountability hitting the wall of combat reality. Admiral Holloway turned slowly, pivoting to face Thorne, who was still frozen at attention. The Admiral's eyes were cold, assessing a grave, potentially catastrophic error. "Lieutenant Colonel Thorne," Holloway stated, the formality signaling absolute condemnation. "Are you familiar with the technical limitations of the Spectre protocol?" Thorne tried to speak, but only a dry click emerged from his throat. He had spent the last 5 minutes bullying the woman who held the operational keys to his multi-million-dollar aircraft, the woman who had just publicly confirmed he was too arrogant to read the operating manual. "Sir," Thorne finally choked out, his salute still rigid. I was under the impression that the advanced cooling system mitigated the thermal issues entirely, sir." Holloway didn't blink. "You were under the impression? You were under the impression about a critical function that dictates the survivability of our pilots and the success of Chimera? This is not a suggestion, Colonel. This is a hard limit programmed by the woman who created the system." He gestured toward Reynolds. The weight of the gesture transferred all the power in the room. "The next 3 hours are the most critical in this operation. Reynolds, Spectre, needs to be focused on real-time countermeasures integration. She doesn't have time to mentor pilots who can't read a basic operational threat assessment." Holloway turned back to Reynolds, his posture shifting back to deference. Ma'am, do you require any additional resources or perhaps a change of scenery? We can have this area cleared immediately if the atmosphere is compromising your focus. Reynolds looked down at the keyboard, then back up at Thorne, who was visibly trembling. She gave a small shake of her head. No, Admiral. I just required the Colonel's full attention, which I now appear to have. She didn't smirk, but the statement was a tactical victory delivered with lethal precision. She looked back at Holloway. The parameters are good. Proceed with the briefing. I'll run diagnostics from here until wheels up. The admirals and generals nodded in unison. The moment was over. The flow of power reversed as quickly as it had inverted. The 7 most powerful commanders in the Air Force turned and moved toward the secured control room door. As Holloway passed Thorne, he didn't stop, but his voice drifted back, cold and sharp. Colonel, I suggest you report to General Miller's aide. You have 3 minutes to memorize the operational ceiling specifications, and then you will personally brief Saritoe Reynolds on the exact measures you will take to ensure you do not destroy the assets she entrusted you with. If you fail to adhere to those limitations, your aircraft will not be the only thing grounded. Understood? Thorne could only manage a whispered, "Yes, Admiral." The heavy door slammed shut, leaving the hangar bay silent, smelling only of ozone and shattered ego. Sergeant Reynolds returned to her keyboard. The 4 junior pilots were staring at Thorne, their expressions a mixture of pity and terror. They realized they had witnessed not a reprimand, but the quiet, immediate destruction of a career. Thorne remained standing at the position of attention, utterly rigid. The sheer weight of the general's contempt, compounded by the shame of being corrected by the legendary Spectre, whom he had called a grease monkey, had rendered him catatonic. Reynolds started typing again, the soft click of the keys filling the room. After a moment, she lifted her hand, pointing silently at a discarded, half-empty coffee mug near Thorne's elbow. Her voice was the same low, quiet contralto, devoid of heat, carrying absolute authority. "Colonel, when you leave to report to General Miller, pick up that mug and wipe the sweat off the console. I need a sterile workspace." Thorne did not hesitate. He moved instantly, picking up the mug with shaking fingers, his polished exterior completely disintegrated. He had faced down enemy fighters with less terror than he now faced the woman he had just insulted. He was looking not at Sergeant Reynolds, but at the shadow of the legend, the ghost who knew more about his machine than he knew about his own heart. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.